Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in the Aligning Land Conservation with Source Water Protection, Tools to Promote Co-Benefits for Forest, Agriculture, and Habitat lunchtime webinar. I'm Stephanie Newmer, a water resources scientist here at the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. I will be assisting with the behind-the-scenes coordination of this webinar. Feel free to use the chat option to contact me if you have any questions. I would like to ask each of you to just please keep in mind to keep your microphones muted and webcams off. After today's presentations have concluded, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question via your audio during this portion of today's webinar, please raise your virtual hand, which can be located at the middle top-ish of your Teams window, and I or another ICPRB staff member will enable your audio and video so you can ask your question. Alternatively, you can also ask questions in the chat anytime during today's presentations, and they will also be addressed during the question and answer session. Lastly, this meeting will be recorded and later posted on the public ICPRB YouTube page for future viewing. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please ask for assistance in the chat, and I will coordinate with you to resolve them. With that, I would like to introduce Mike Nardelili, the Executive Director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. I'm the Executive Director of ICPRB, and I'm very pleased to kick off this event. This event is being held as part of the implementation of the Potomac Basin Comprehensive Water Resources Plan. This is the 11th in a series of webinars to learn and share information about land use practices for sustainable water resources management in the Potomac Basin. The last webinar in this series, hosted by ICPRB in December 2025, showcased the Potomac Land Prioritization Tool. The tool prioritizes land parcels for conservation from a drinking water protection perspective. Users of the tool are encouraged to layer this perspective with others that might be important to their work. Land conservation is very near and dear to my heart. I was the former head of a land trust in Virginia, and I think the tool is an excellent guide for land trusts and local governments to prioritize their work in the basin. Today's webinar will highlight three complementary approaches to conservation prioritization, showcasing tools, datasets, and metrics that can be used independently or paired with the ICPRB land prioritization tool to inform conservation easements, assess vulnerability to development or other stressors, and identify lands that provide multiple ecosystem service benefits. The event is being hosted by ICPRB with funding from our 2026 Section 106 grant from the EPA under the Clean Water Act. Our moderator today is Jeff Lerner with the EPA. Jeff works across the country for EPA's Office of Water toward watershed-based approaches and partnerships for water quality, living resources, and watershed finance. Prior to EPA working with foundations, Jeff helped provide funding, capacity support, and technical assistance for several million acres of habitat conservation and water protection. Jeff has worked with the Chesapeake Bay program on healthy watersheds and now protected lands under the revised Bay Agreement. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff to moderate the panel. Take it away, Jeff.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And thanks for having me here, and welcome everybody this afternoon's presentation. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation that we're going to have here. And I just want to say before we get going that I've got some history with the ICPRB Land Prioritization Project that Mike just mentioned. And I want to say how important it is and what a great product. It's very thoughtful in its methods, very expansive in its thinking. And it's very timely, I think, also, as water utilities around the country continue to rate long-term drinking water viability and source water protection among their top issues and concerns. And as Mike said, I work for EPA, and I help encourage large watershed-based partnerships. And as we do that, we find ourselves happily intertwined, I think, with many other benefits of healthy watersheds besides water quality. And those include working forests, wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation, hazard mitigation, and other working lands. And in fact, one of the other partnerships that we have is with the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, where we collaborate on both source water protection and also on the National Water Quality Initiative that helps primarily agricultural producers with conservation practices that protect watershed lands or improve water quality. And their programs, NRCS programs, are an important part of the watershed funding landscape. We don't have them here with us today, but perhaps we could actually think about that as a future webinar in this series. What we do have for you today are presentations on forests and also on wildlife habitat, two of the most important complementary land uses for healthy watersheds. And as the chair of the Protected Lands Work Group of the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, I can tell you that we're trying to protect at least an additional 2 million acres of land in the watershed over the next decade or so, and that we'd like to see a lot of that be either forests or wildlife habitat, which includes not only forested wetlands, but also other types of wetlands, stream corridors, nearshore habitat, but also headwaters, which are often forested and source water areas. We have two speakers that I'll now introduce. Katie Brownson is the U.S. Forest Service liaison to the Chesapeake Bay program and coordinates the program's forestry work group. In this capacity, Katie facilitates partnerships to advance forest restoration and conservation in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Katie's been terrific to work with over the last couple of years. She's played a very important role in revisions to the Chesapeake Bay Agreement and its additional emphasis on forest conservation that you're going to hear about today. Jake Riley is also here with us. Jake is the director of Chesapeake Bay programs with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Jake has experience in policy and management of federal, state, and local environmental and agricultural conservation programs with a focus on watershed management, climate resilience, and innovative finance. And prior to his role at NIFWF, Jake served as a policy analyst with the White House Office of Management and Budget. He holds degrees in agricultural and natural resource economics and environmental science and policy from the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University. We are very happy to have both of these experts with us today to share their information with you. We're going to start with forests. And if we could get Katie's slides lined up, I would be very happy to welcome Katie and turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I think I am sharing my own screen if all goes well. So I will get those slides pulled up now.
And
all right.
That looks great. Thanks,
Looking
Katie.
good. Great. Thanks for confirming that. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm happy to share some relatively new tools that we've been developing here at the Bay Program for better understanding forest trends and conservation opportunities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So before jumping into those tools, just want to provide a little bit of context on why these products were developed and kind of bridging that gap with the Chesapeake Bay program, as Jeff was starting to do as well. You know, I think the Bay program's really long recognized the really important role that forests play in providing clean water to the Chesapeake Bay and all the local waterways. But there's so many other co-benefits as well for us, for wildlife, fish, and communities. In the drinking water space, as you all are well aware, I'm sure conserving forests are really critical for maintaining clean drinking water, with all of those other benefits for habitats and communities. So I think, you know, the emphasis of the Bay program on conserving forests has really only grown under the most recent watershed agreement. The Chesapeake Bay Executive Council approved its new watershed agreement in December. And there were really some pretty big changes for watershed forestry. And I think Stephanie's going to be posting the link for the full 2025 watershed agreement in the chat if you haven't checked it out already. But we have a really broad, holistic outcome now that calls on us to conserve, manage, and restore forests and tree cover throughout the entire watershed, not just in riparian areas and communities where we had historically been focusing most of our efforts at the Bay program. We still do have those specific targets for tree canopy and riparian forest buffers, but now we have this new target for forest conservation as well, and really embedded in all of them, there's an intention for conservation. And we're setting both long-term stretch goals for what we think we need to do to conserve and restore forests over the long term, as well as setting shorter term, somewhat more achievable goals for 2040. And for all three of these, numeric sets of numeric targets that we've developed, we're going to be relying on this new, not new, but this high resolution land use, land cover monitoring data that the Bay program is providing to evaluate progress, which is also the basis for the tools that I'm going to be sharing. So I did just want to provide a little bit of context on the data itself before jumping into the tools, just to provide some context here. So the high resolution land use, land cover data covers all of the counties that intersect or are adjacent to the Chesapeake Bay watershed, covering 99,000 square miles, and it's at 1 meter resolution. So it's a much finer spatial resolution than the NLCD data that was used to develop that ICPRB conservation prioritization tool. There are 3 time points for the data now. So we have data going back to 2013-14 with the most recent data that we have now from 2021-2022. And there's a 4th time point that's going to be that's under development that is expected in 2028. And it's a very rich data set. So there's 56 land use, land cover classes contained in the data set. So this is the full set of land use, land cover classes. And so even when you just look at the classes that are in the red boxes, those are all the ones that relate to forests or trees in some way. So we do have kind of a strict forest class that has criteria adhering largely to the FIA definition of forest inventory and analysis definition of forest. So the strict forest areas are areas with tree cover greater than 1 acre with a minimum patch width of 36 meters at an undisturbed or unmanaged understory. But there's a lot of other information in this data set about forests and trees in various contexts throughout the landscape as well, including working forests. So looking across all of the major land uses with this data, despite being a heavily populated watershed, the majority of the watershed's land area is still natural, 68%, with most of that natural area being in forests. Nearly 20% is in some form of agriculture, with the remaining being developed. So I think this speaks to just the scale of conservation opportunity that we have within the Chesapeake Bay watershed with so much natural and agricultural land. So if you are interested in accessing the raw data or the tabular summaries, it's all available here. The data was produced primarily by USGS and the Chesapeake Conservancy with funding from the EPA Bay program. And there's a lot to explore there. So if you are a data nerd, I definitely recommend just going directly to the data and exploring it that way. But for a lot of people, I'd say that the data is very dense and it can be challenging to understand without really digging deep into some of the documentation. So the tools that I'm going to be highlighting now were really designed to better support our partners, local decision makers, practitioners, and others, so they can really leverage this high resolution data to better understand their forest and tree canopy, how they're changing over time, and where there might be the best opportunities to advance forest conservation and restoration, all in support of implementing this revised Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So the first tool I'm going to highlight here is the State of Chesapeake Forest Story Map. I do want to give a lot of appreciation to USGS, especially Michelle Petoskey, Sarah McDonald, and Dave Strong for all their support with processing the data and developing these web apps. that I'm going to be showing you. You can use this QR code here to access it, and I think a link is going to get posted in the chat as well if that's easier. And I did just want to give a heads up that at the end, we are going to have a few questions for you. So as you go along, if you could be thinking about how you might use these tools and any other data or tools that you might find helpful to complement this to help inform your decision making, we are gonna ask for some participation at the end. So you can get your wheels spinning now as I'm going through the presentation here. So some highlights of the story map. We published original State of Chesapeake Forest story map in 2023 with the first round of change data that was released with the high resolution land use land cover data. And it was really designed to build on a 2006 State of Chesapeake Forest report. It's really a book, and it provided a really comprehensive look at the history of forests in the watershed, their importance, and the best data that they had at that time on forest extent, composition, and forest health. But obviously, this high resolution data has really significantly advanced our understanding of Chesapeake forests. And so after that original 2023 story map, we just updated it again in September of 2025 with the latest 2021-2022 data. And so highlights of this new story map include updated estimates on the ecosystem services benefits that tree cover is providing in the watershed. We summarized data on forest and tree canopy change across the watershed in a consistent way. We have a series of interactive maps where you can kind of explore, you know, trends in your county or locality. We also have a set of case studies that really explore the drivers of forest and tree canopy change. And then we link to these tree cover fact sheets that I'm going to talk about in more detail at the end of my presentation. So throughout the story map, we produced some summary statistics for two groupings of forest and tree classes. So I thought I'd take a minute here just to define these groupings. So forested extent is tree canopy with an unmanaged understory. So we're thinking about, you know, forested lands, as well as early successional forests, including areas that were recently harvested and areas undergoing natural succession. So there's some places where we're including lands that may not actually have trees currently, but that are part of that successional cycle where we're expecting that trees are regrowing on the landscape. Tree cover, on the other hand, includes all of the places on the landscape where we do actually have trees. But this also includes developed tree cover classes, so things like tree canopy over roads and sidewalks, you know, that we wouldn't really think about as being a forest in a traditional sense. So in the context of source water protection, you know, I'd say forest extent is probably the most relevant grouping for you all, since that land is either forested or in the process of regrowing into forest. And if you look on the right there, we have some summary statistics on the relative amount of land that has tree cover and a forested extent within the Chesapeake Bay watershed portion of those states that you see there. You'll see there's a good range of tree cover and forested extent. So looking at some of the big picture findings we present in the story map, as of 2021 and 2022, we found that trees are covering 62% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and the majority of those acres are in forest, as opposed to kind of those more developed tree canopy classes over turf or impervious surfaces. And using the iTree suite of models, we estimate that those trees in the Chesapeake Bay watershed alone are providing over $15.3 billion in benefits annually from air pollution removal, reduced stormwater runoff, and carbon sequestration. The story map does provide some downloadable infographics on the amount and type of tree cover found in each state, similar to that watershed-wide infographic you see there on the left. As well as estimates on the ecosystem service benefits being provided by tree cover by state. So if you're interested in having those factoids about the place you live, we do provide those, and we have a full spreadsheet as well with a lot more detailed data if you're interested in exploring the iTree ecosystem services data as well. So zooming in a bit, we have a series of county level viewers in the story map. So this one is focused on tree cover. And it includes summary data on the amount of tree cover in the watershed. Sorry that this is probably a little bit small to read here, but if you open it up in the story map, you'll be able to read it a lot clearer, I hope. But some more detailed information about how that tree cover is distributed across the various classes, whether it's found in forest or some of those other developed tree cover classes. And then this bar chart on the right compares how the selected county compares with other counties in that state and in the watershed overall. So you can get a sense of whether the county has a relatively high amount of tree cover or a relatively low amount of tree cover. This is a similar viewer to what I just showed, but this one is for forested extent. So that's that grouping of all of the lands that we think are either mature forest now or are in earlier successional stages and regrowing into forest. And so these status maps, I think, give us a good idea of where we have the most forests left on the landscape to conserve. So if you're interested in forest conservation, you could use these county level maps to start narrowing in on some of the counties that have the most forest cover in the watershed, and then use ICPRB's prioritization maps potentially to start zooming in on those areas and parcels within that county that are high priority for conservation. So I think there's a lot of potential for these tools to be used in parallel to target conservation activities. So moving into the change data, we can start to better understand vulnerability to development and other stressors. So we found that across the watershed, we had a net loss of over 104,000 acres of tree cover to development alone from that first time period from 2013-14 to the last time period of 2021-22. And so just to clarify, this is not capturing land cover transitions that are a result of forest management. This is transition from a treed class to one of our developed classes that we think is probably a more permanent loss of tree cover on the landscape. And so when we look at the ecosystem service data from iTree, we can estimate that this tree cover loss is resulting in the reduction of $331 million in benefits annually that those trees were providing from stormwater, runoff abatement, carbon storage, and air pollution removal. So we also have two viewers for the change data to get a better idea of where that vulnerability is to conversion in more detail. So this one is for tree cover change. And so for this one, you can visualize the relative amount of tree cover change to development, both at the county scale and at the municipal scale. And again, you can compare that relative amount of change with other counties in the state and the watershed. This particular viewer also houses links to the tree cover fact sheets that I am teasing a little bit here, but I'm going to talk about in more detail in just a couple minutes. So if you look in that red circle, you can select the fact sheet for the county that you've selected, and it's going to pull up more detailed information about the status of tree cover in that county and how it's changed. We also have parallel fact sheets for all of the municipalities in the watershed as well. So if you select the municipality, you'll have a similar sort of pop-up option. So this final viewer is a forested extent loss viewer. So this viewer starts similar to the others as a county level viewer when you first open it up. But we wanted to be able to see at a finer resolution where this loss is happening on the landscape to better inform land use planning decisions, conservation prioritization, and things like that. So as you zoom in, you can, the map kind of automatically transitions into what we call a hex map, which is what you see here. And it's showing forested extent loss for every square kilometer in the watershed, so you can better understand where loss is occurring. And that bar chart on the top is showing what classes the forest is transitioning to, so we can see where we're losing forest, like what are the major drivers of forested extent loss in the landscape. And then again, a chart kind of showing how the loss in that county compares with other jurisdictions in the state and the watershed. So in both of these change sections, for both tree cover change and forested extent change, we have a series of case studies where we're exploring some of the drivers of change. We're highlighting some of the major challenges and successful examples of approaches that are being used to conserve forests and tree canopy. So these include some case studies on solar development, local ordinances to guide solar development, forest markets, local forest conservation policies, and more. So I'd encourage you to explore those. I think there's some interesting tidbits in there and examples that might be applicable in the place that you work. And I will also mention that we are always looking for more case studies, so please reach out if there's something that you would like to see a case study on that you don't currently have, or if there's something you'd like to highlight from the organization or place where you work. Maybe when we go to do the next update, we could even have a little case study on forest conservation for source water protection. So we are actively working on updating the story map. As we dive into the data, we are constantly figuring out how much more there is to explore in it. It is a really rich data set. Our current plans for updating, we had some new analyses completed already that's looking at plantable space in the watershed as well as forest fragmentation across the watershed. The Chesapeake Conservancy completed those analyses for us, and we're just trying to kind of figure out how to best serve up those analyses within the context of the new story map, so stay tuned for that. We've also heard a lot of interest in better understanding riparian forest status and trends, so we're going to be doing some additional analyses and visualizations on riparian forests in particular. And before we know it, there's going to be a whole nother round of data for 2025 and 2026 in a couple years. And so the hope is that we can kind of keep this story map updated and relevant as new data comes out. But we are always interested in letting and hearing from folks about what would be most useful. So if there are other things that you'd like to see, please do reach out. So the last thing I want to highlight here, I think, is the tree canopy status and change fact sheets that I've been referencing. So these were produced in collaboration with all the folks listed on the bottom there, the Conservancy, UVM, USGS, the Forest Service, and the Forestry Work Group. And we have fact sheets for every county and municipality in the watershed available, both via that story map and via this tree canopy network website that you're seeing here, which also houses a more detailed data guide if you're interested in kind of better understanding the data and how it was produced. So just a quick snapshot of some of the kind of key components of these two-page fact sheets. So again, you can get some high-level numbers on the amount of tree cover, the benefits being provided by trees, how the tree cover has changed. We have some high-level statistics on land use, how tree cover is broken up across the various tree canopy classes. And then we have that more detailed hex map again here, where you can see where within the jurisdiction tree canopy is being lost and gained. And those bar graphs are showing where the land uses where we're gaining tree canopy from, so where are trees growing, and then the land uses that we're losing that tree canopy to. So when trees are being lost, what is it transitioning to? And again, we're really focused on loss to the developed classes here in these fact sheets. And so you can access the fact sheets with the QR code, and definitely encourage folks to help us spread the word about these tools that are available if there are folks that you know that would be interested in using them. Okay, this is really the last one, but I did want to just highlight that the Bay program has a lot of data and tools. It used to be really hard to find them or even know what was out there. But now we have Chesapeake data, which is great. It's a handy kind of central repository for all of the Bay program data and tools. And they were kind enough to create a feature collection for tree canopy and forests. And there's also another one for land conservation. So I'd encourage you to peruse both of those because there are a lot more data and tools as well found in those, but just wanted to highlight those two relatively new ones that we worked on most closely here with you all today. So I think that is all I have to share, and I believe there are some discussion questions that are going to be getting queued up for you all in the chat. But my contact info is there, and please feel free to reach out if you have questions or comments that we don't get to address today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Katie. That's a lot of information, obviously a lot of things to dig through. So I would encourage folks, if you have questions, I'm not seeing questions in the chat, but if you have questions for Katie, please plug them into the chat. And I think, Stephanie, are we getting a couple of questions, poll questions or other questions lined up here?
Yes, they are posed in the Q&A tab.
Ah, okay.
So anybody should be able to go in and add a comment. There are 2 questions posted. How do you think you could use the tools that Katie presented and data to support your efforts? And then what additional data about forests do you need to prioritize conservation efforts? If you have trouble accessing these questions in the Q&A tab, just let me know in the chat and I can pop them in the chat instead.
Yeah, so if anything's coming to mind as you're thinking about this presentation, please, as you're listening to the rest of the webinar here, type those in. We can possibly address your questions during the Q&A session here, but if not, if we do have your thoughts on this, we can at least try to capture those, and that may be helpful to Katie and her colleagues as they're thinking about future iterations of the story map and other ways to present the data, et cetera. I'm just going to ask one more time if anyone has any questions right now, quickly, before we turn it over to Jake. Okay, not hearing anything or seeing anything, and Stephanie, I'm not seeing any hands. So with that, why don't we move over to Jake's presentation? Welcome, Jake. We're happy to hear about your work and the Foundation's work on Chesapeake Wild.
Yes, thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks to the ICPRB team for inviting me here. So I'm Jake Riley, Director of Chesapeake and Central Appalachia programs for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Talk a little bit about sort of, how NIFWF goes about kind of prioritizing projects in our competitive grants programs. So it'll be a little bit of kind of Katie's flavor, offering you all some suggested sort of tools and resources that either NIFWF has sort of helped to furnish or we're sort of using strategically ourselves, but maybe in a little bit of a pivot as well. I think one of the things I'm going to be talking about is NIFWF is really sort of entering into a time frame here where we are going to be essentially sort of reassessing our priorities, right, and sort of doing another round of strategic planning for our Chesapeake work. So that's really where, quite honestly, as much as you all are looking for support from us, right, in terms of, information on helpful tools and resources, really interested both today and sort of moving forward with ICPRB and other partners in sort of creating the mechanisms to really sort of gather more of those priorities from you all directly, right? I think one of the things that we find as a funder here is that it's all well and good for us to sort of set sort of high-level conservation goals and those kinds of things, but ultimately it relies on the practitioners on the ground, right, to be aligned and bought in for NIFWF to be able to sort of hit those goals, right? So really for us, it's about meeting grantees and partners where they are in terms of how they're prioritizing projects as much as it is about NIFWF itself, right, prioritizing projects. So just quickly for those that might not be as familiar, so NIFWF, as we're known in the parlance, we're a 501c3 congressionally chartered foundation. We have a board of directors that's appointed by the Secretary of the Interior, ex officio positions for the Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Administrator of NOAA, for example. And we're operating certainly north of $500 million a year in annual conservation grants that we're putting out there at a national level. What we do and sort of how we do it is really NIFWF is sort of a pooled funding mechanism, right? So we pull in money from federal agency partners, corporate partners, other foundations. And generally what we do most often is we are sort of crafting landscape scale programs, right? So we pool these resources, we identify landscapes of interest, we identify strategic priorities, and then we run competitive grants programs, right? To sort of finance and support on the ground work, right, that is sort of consistent with and driving our high level outcomes. We're a national foundation, right? So this handy map, it's like our chickenpox map. It shows all the grants that we've made, in our history. So almost 24,000 grants, right? You see some of the statistics there. The nice thing for our Chesapeake partners is, even up until a couple of years ago, you used to be able to see on this map the explicit outline of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, just because of the volume of funding and projects that we've had the fortune of supporting over the years. NIFWF continues to grow. I now fortunately manage our Central Apps program, so there's more dots on the map every year, right? But the point is, we're a national foundation, right? We've got a long history here in the Chesapeake. And this map is also helpful for contextualizing sort of the next slide here, which kind of gets me into a little bit of kind of the NIFWF kind of priority setting process, right? So all of our priorities, at the foundation level, all the way down to sort of the individual grant program and project selection level, are really informed by what we call our conservation framework, right? I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide, but the major point here for this slide and for you all is that really kind of the organizing principle for NIFWF under this conservation framework is landscapes of conservation importance, right? So the Chesapeake Bay has been one of those landscapes since we started down this path, really about 15 years ago. We have an existing business plan for our Chesapeake work. These business plans are our strategic plans for each one of these landscapes, right? So again, the Chesapeake is one of our strategic landscapes, and so really does sort of have this really robust strategy and sort of prioritization kind of thought process that goes into our programs and ultimately grant selection. So what that means in practice is, our framework sets sort of the landscapes that we care about. Once we identify those landscapes that we care about, we then develop what we call business plans, right? We have a lot of financial folks on our board of directors, for example, so maybe no surprise that they're interested in business and sort of investment strategy, sort of the parlance. Historically, these business plans have been like 10-year plans for, a set of goals and outcomes and strategies that NIFWF wants to achieve in each one of those landscapes. We then use our competitive grants programs, which are usually on sort of an annual basis, to be able to put RFPs out and then solicit projects that are advancing those business plans. And then, the most competitive, most successful projects are funded, and then the on-the-ground work that supports those grants is ultimately what rolls up for us in contributing to those business plan or those kind of landscape level sort of outcomes. So we've got sort of different layers here, right? But the business planning piece is probably, I think, the piece that I'll certainly be talking about the most next in terms of, how we sort of go about setting those priorities. Quickly, though, I just wanted to kind of level set. So, got a little bit of the foundation, at sort of the national level. In the Chesapeake, I mentioned we've been doing work explicitly, directly in the Chesapeake for more than 25 years now. We deliver that work under what we call the Chesapeake Bay Stewardship Fund. So this is a pooled funding mechanism drawing most directly from EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal side, but other companies and foundations to provide kind of three key things, right? The first, and what folks know us most for, is our competitive grants program. So Chesapeake Wild Grants was one that was already mentioned. I would also just offer that we have two other companion programs for the Chesapeake Bay drainage. Those are funded by EPA. So our Innovative Nutrient and Sediment Reduction Grants, those are squarely focused on supporting the jurisdictions achieving TMDL and sort of with load reduction targets. And then the Small Watershed Grants program, which is aimed much more broadly at supporting the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, right? So for example, when you heard Katie talk about forests getting as much priority and play in the watershed agreement as ever right now, that's very exciting for us because it means that in our Small Watershed Grants program, we can start funding forestry work in a way that we haven't really in the past, right? So these competitive grants programs, that's what people know us most for. That's certainly the large majority of our funding and our effort. But we also do provide a couple other things through the Stewardship Fund that are relevant here. One is contracted technical assistance support. So we have field liaisons, we have environmental compliance support, we have now federal fiscal and administrative compliance support, right? So not just the competitive programs, we're kind of trying to provide sort of wraparound services to grantees to kind of help them be successful in applying for funding and managing grants. And then we also do provide sort of directed grant support for more sort of core kind of partnership kinds of investments that advance conservation more broadly. And I would put some of this prioritization stuff in that bucket. I'll get to a couple examples where NIFWF has just directly funded some partners to furnish some tools and some analyses that we use ourselves. Of course, as you can imagine, we fund a lot of tool development and prioritization in individual competitive grant proposals as well, right? So we might be working with a specific water utility who wants to develop a prioritization schema or that sort of thing, right, for their work. So it happens at sort of different levels for us. What I will say quickly as we get to kind of prioritization is I have sort of learned in my time at NIFWF that NIFWF can prioritize itself out of good conservation projects. And so what I mean by that is sort of the scale of prioritization. And ultimately for a program, for a national foundation and for our Chesapeake programs working at the Bay watershed scale, Katie was sharing amazing data at the 1 meter resolution or even sort of square kilometer level. I think for us, we're really kind of focused at a larger geographic scale, right, in terms of kind of prioritization. So us telling folks at that geographic scale where we think there's opportunity, where we think there's need, but then on the other side, really wanting to incentivize and reward applicants and partners to bring us their own strategies and plans for how they're going to prioritize work. So it's a balance, right? But I think we see value in both, and we certainly do both. So the first little bit here that I'm going to touch on before I kind of hit on some example tools is this business planning process, right? So this is all prospective and maybe not so helpful for folks that are looking for discrete tools right now, but it is really important for us in this whole prioritization discussion. So NIFWF writ large, we completed a strategic plan not too long ago at sort of the national level. That strategic plan, sort of the tagline for us from a conservation perspective was bigger, better, bolder. And so the way that we see that playing out in our programming is really through what these business plans are, right? And so through this new strategic plan, we have essentially crafted this vision for a next generation of NIFWF conservation business plan, right? We want bigger impact, bigger scale, more species, more money, right? As well as the ability to deliver on co-benefits as well, right? So our Chesapeake program is one of the first programs that's going to be going through this next-gen business planning process. My colleagues in the Southeast just sort of have been the first officially at NIFWF that have gone through this. But it's a really exciting moment for us. And I think the point of the next couple slides is to provide you all a little bit of direction of that sort of overall sort of process and what the opportunity is before I kind of share a couple additional tools. So, the big thing for us on, this next gen of business planning is I mentioned sort of we use these business plans to have historically used these business plans to set sort of 10-year targets, right? Like these are 10-year plans. I think we've recognized that conservation takes time. It takes time for the value of these investments to sort of accrue. And so this next gen of conservation business plan for us, they're going to be 30-year plans, which is sort of revolutionary in the conservation space, right? That's probably the major tagline, but of course we want to be ambitious. It's not just about projects, it's about building partnerships and capacity, and then certainly about building in opportunities to adaptively learn and manage over time, right? So what that looks like in practice. So what you have on this slide is we call it the leaf slide around NIFWF. You have sort of our current sort of business planning model on the left and our future business planning model there on the right. So, current business planning or historical business planning, they've been these 10-year timeframes. We focused on focal species, for example, and really only measuring things in focal areas, right? We haven't been thinking about co-benefits for, water, carbon, jobs, that kind of thing. And when we look at the budgets for our historic business plans, it's really been focused on what NIFWF feels like it can reasonably sort of fundraise for, right, to be able to get work going on the ground. Moving forward, this next generation of business plans, I mentioned they're 30-year plans. We are envisioning a much more robust, but also sort of refined, nuanced approach to measurement across the landscape. As we look at impact and co-benefits of this next generation of plans, this webinar is spot on because one of the things that we're going to be looking for is those co-benefits beyond, right, discrete species and habitat sort of benefits. So communities like ICPRB, water providers are, an excellent kind of resource and network for us in terms of filling in some of those kind of pieces, right? And then when we look at the budget, for example, and it gets to some of our kind of goals in these next-gen plans as well, we're really looking at what the entire landscape needs, right? Not just what NIFWF thinks it can fund or fundraise for, but given the conservation need on the landscape, what kinds of scale of work do we need? What kind of budgets do collectively, we all need to be able to hit some of these goals? So as it relates to the Chesapeake Bay, the process hasn't officially started for us yet, but we've of course started to think about it. Most specifically, I think for this audience, the most important thing here is that historically and sort of our current Chesapeake Bay business plan, we have been focused a lot on water quality work. And so naturally, I think our historic habitat priorities in our Chesapeake work have been focused on aquatic habitats. This next gen of plan will absolutely establish for the first time ever in our Chesapeake work terrestrial habitat priorities. Forests for sure are going to be one of those, but we also think, for example, grasslands as well. So that's going to be a great opportunity, I think, as we continue to build this out to kind of refine and sort of tweak this conversation around prioritization for things like land conservation, right? What kinds of benefits for species habitat, but also for water supply, water quality might be going into kind of project selection and prioritization. And last thing here on the next gen planning before I will actually share a couple tools. We do have plans for much more expanded and sort of formal engagement of external partners as we go through this process of developing this next gen business plan. And so this is all very high level at this point and sort of what's on your slide. But the point is that we will be seeking lots of opportunities like this webinar, but also, things like stakeholder workshops, those kinds of things moving forward to help gather input from stakeholders and conservation partners across the region on how NIFWIF should prioritize projects, right? So this isn't just NIFWIF making these decisions in isolation. We envision, an expanded sort of formal process of engaging partners over the next 12 to 18 months on these kind of topics. So again, the timing here is great to sort of start some of these conversations, at least with the ICPRB community here as an example. Okay, so I will actually do what I was asked to do here today, which is just start to share, some example tools and resources that we found useful, either we funded directly or, we found applicants have used effectively in terms of prioritizing their own work, right? And then sort of elevating those proposals in our review processes. So short and sweet on tools for prioritizing forests. First and foremost, I would point you all to the amazing stuff that Katie has provided. Our Chesapeake kind of landscape is so rich and robust through the Bay Program partnership in terms of the resources. So Katie provided a lot of great resources, that tree canopy and forest kind of Chesapeake data webpage is what's there. But we would definitely encourage folks to make very strong and effective use of really all of the data and tools that the Bay Program is putting out, because there has been a lot of collective investment in them. So not just this tree canopy and forest page, but lots of the other resources as well. Another sort of consideration or example, at least in terms of how we think about and prioritize forest work in NIFWIF programs, is actually an example from our Central Appalachia program, which there is a bit of overlap, or at least historically has been a bit of overlap with the Chesapeake Bay watershed, including the Potomac Basin. We've kind of trimmed that a bit for some reasons, but the important point here is that, in our Central Apps program to the west, let's say, of the Potomac Basin, and then also for our Delaware River program to the east of the Bay watershed, we actually have developed forest priorities already. So as NIFWIF goes about sort of reassessing and establishing forest habitat priorities in our Chesapeake programs moving forward, we'll very likely be sort of pulling from a lot of those strategies and kind of approaches in those other programs. And so I would suggest, and maybe there will be a shared link here. We have a mapping portal for our Central Apps business plan. We have a business plan for our Central Apps program, and we have very explicit kind of forestry goals. When NIFWIF is thinking about forestry, especially in a place like the Potomac Basin, we're most directly thinking about habitat for interior forest dwelling species, so bird species. So things like cerulean warbler, golden wing warbler, wood thrush, for example. And we're also thinking about scale, right? So the point here is that, we're trying to get at large contiguous blocks of forest being effectively managed, right? So that we have a diversity of age classes in those forests that support different species that need different age classes, right? So doing forest conservation, forest management work contiguously at scale, but also mindful of a diversity of age classes within those forestry systems, right, to be able to meet different sort of habitat needs. So we've got our Central Apps business plan. There's a mapping portal there. Certainly, I would say not as robust as all the amazing tools that Katie has already provided on the forestry stuff. So part of the reason why I'd sort of encourage you to go check out those resources as well, because they're fabulous. Okay. Tools for prioritizing freshwater habitat. So there certainly is a bit more history here for us in terms of tools and resources that are available. So Certainly in the Potomac Basin, we've had a long set of priorities around brook trout conservation and restoration work. NIFWF over the years has supported Trout Unlimited and the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture and others, including the Bay Program's Brook Trout Work Group, in developing this Eastern Brook Trout conservation portfolio, right? And the point here is that this is really looking range-wide at brook trout across its entire range and helping NIFWF and partners prioritize restoration work versus conservation work, right? You can see some of the colors in the bottom left-hand map there. Basically, this analysis sort of gets down to what's called a patch scale. So it's essentially a combination of kind of watershed boundaries, but also aquatic connectivity considerations, right? So it really sort of identifies, patches based on connectivity, but also based on habitat quality. So, it's an amazing resource of, being able to understand where there are brook trout resources, where there might be opportunities through things like connectivity or uplands habitat improvement or stream restoration improvement, right? So a really tremendous and robust resource there. They're actually undergoing a refresh and an update of that portfolio as we speak, and it should be available probably sometime early in 2027. So I would encourage folks to kind of stay tuned for that. That's a legacy priority for us on the freshwater habitat side of things. An emergent habitat priority for us is freshwater mussels, right? There's a lot of energy and enthusiasm around freshwater mussel conservation and restoration here in the region. And so we have just started actually to fund the development of a number of kind of strategic planning efforts, right? Aimed at better informing freshwater mussel conservation and restoration work across the Bay watershed. So what you see there is we funded Western Pennsylvania Conservancy to develop this Pennsylvania freshwater mussel conservation plan. They've got separate sections for each major drainage in Pennsylvania. So at least for the Pennsylvania's portion of the Potomac Basin, they've got some specific priority sort of places and catchments or subwatersheds to kind of prioritize different types of freshwater mussel conservation work. So again, these are focused more on specific aquatic species, but looking at overlaps with some of your drinking water priority areas, great tools to be able to understand where you have existing high quality resources that might further justify or sort of, rationalize, investments in land conservation, right? But also, restoration work itself. I'd also just say here too, and again, hats off to ICPRB. One of the things, certainly we think about freshwater habitat, we think about benthics. That is sort of the natural bridge for us between a lot of our historic water quality work and tracking load reductions versus actual meaningful improvements in freshwater habitat. So we love benthic information. We love the BIBI as a consistent tool. So it's great that ICPRB has such a strong role in furnishing that product, and would just encourage folks to know, NIFWF uses it and loves it, but also if you're not familiar with it or haven't really sort of fully integrated yourself, it's a tremendous resource. And then last thing here is just quickly on sort of, some of the sort of tools and examples of things we use to kind of prioritize ag and water quality work. First, hats off to ICPRB. I think the prioritization study that you all did is a fabulous tool to be able to kind of focus conservation work in place specifically for, drinking water supplies. So that's a tool and a resource that is tremendous. We're not out there pushing that tool ourselves to our grantees, but I think that, a lot of our folks are familiar with it. And I think there's lots of opportunities to continue better applying that tool that's out there. But we also use other things like EPA has developed this most effective basins analysis that really identifies from an agricultural perspective most directly where the biggest opportunities to actually drive the most kind of cost-effective nutrient sediment load reductions, right? And then on the bottom corner of the slide, you see it's just another kind of posting of the stream health, the BIBI information, because we do think about that in the water quality sense as well. But what you see here, and if I go back a couple slides, when you see maps right here, what you see is, we're not getting down NIFWF generally to a parcel level in terms of prioritization, right? So that really is this kind of bridge between NIFWF being able to kind of help furnish the tools and the resources that are helpful for folks themselves to prioritize work, but also really meeting folks where they are, right? And being able to incentivize more locally driven approaches to prioritization. So that's about all I have. I'm not going to have time to kind of keep this slide up here, but certainly we are not a black box funder. We live to talk to folks that are interested in conservation. So if you have any questions coming on the end of this or, applying for future grants, please do feel free to reach out. Thank you much.
Great. Thank you, Jake. I guess a question for ICPRB, are the are the slide decks going to be available to folks if they want it, or just be as part of the recording?
Generally, we release those as part of the recording, not individually.
Okay.
We could work with the authors directly if there was a participant that wanted access to those, though.
I just thought there was a lot of great information in there, and maybe there were some embedded links and things like that that people might like to have access to. So thank you. We are almost out of time here. If anyone has any burning questions, we'll try to entertain them, but I do want to make sure that we take the opportunity to thank our presenters. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Katie, for thought-provoking presentations. I think there's a lot of information here to digest. I guess a last question for both Jake and Katie, because the emphasis of this webinar was on land conservation. I am kind of curious if either one of you have any additional thoughts on accessing your funds or resources to specifically support land conservation going forward. If you have any insight into that, or specifically a nexus with, like, if a water utility or someone who is interested in source water protection also wanted to access some of your funds or resources for land protection, what advice would you give them?
Yes, great question. I would just say quickly, come talk to us, come find us. I think I mentioned we have multiple available programs. The Chesapeake Wild program is probably the best fit for straight up land conservation projects. So just a little bit of a cheat code there for folks, but please do reach out. And then beyond some of the species and habitat stuff, of course, things that we love to see with respect to land conservation are things like connectivity, right, as well. So that's, part of the, suite of things that come into play for us, but certainly reach out to us, I think would be the point.
I guess I would just add that, I think historically there's been this kind of disconnect between the Chesapeake Bay program and source water protection efforts, even though we're trying to do a lot of the same things, in terms of forest restoration and conservation. And, I think we've been trying to think through creatively ways to kind of break down that gap that we've been dealing with. And one relatively new effort that's getting going now that folks should be aware of, and if I can find the link quick, I can throw it in the chat, but there's this Northeast Mid-Atlantic Partnership for Forests and Water that it's a much bigger regional partnership, really the whole Northeast Mid-Atlantic region. But part of the goal of that is to bring together the source water protection community with the forestry community, and a lot of folks that are involved with the Bay program are our forestry partners that are, involved with the forestry work group at the Bay program are getting involved with that as well too. So there might be opportunities there to kind of better think through what the opportunities are for kind of linking source water protection and forest conservation through this broader regional partnership. And their next meeting is actually going to be in Pennsylvania, which is in our neck of the woods, and they're going to be doing some more implementation work down here under a new landscape scale restoration grant. So that's pretty exciting.
Well, that's a great connection, Katie, and thanks for mentioning that. And I also want to just thank ICPRB for inviting us and putting this together, because I think by doing so, you've tried to connect the Chesapeake Bay interests together. And so I think I heard both Katie and Jake talk about how there might be a way to link together what ICPRB has done with their land prioritization with some of the other data that you heard about. And so I would encourage us to think about that together as a community. And certainly Renee and Heidi and Carlington and some of the other ICPRB folks, I think we'd be happy to continue these discussions. And with that, I want to thank all of you for spending your lunchtime with us. I think that's all the time we have, and we're going to have to wrap up at this point. So thank you again.